I am telling this now because time has finally taken more from me than fear ever did, and because some truths become heavier the longer they are buried, especially the ones sealed behind concrete, signatures, and silence. It began with an order that carried no explanation and left no paper trail, just a brief instruction to report without uniform, identification, or personal equipment to a location listed as decommissioned, an abandoned military base erased from public records after what official files described as structural failure, a phrase vague enough to hide almost anything. And when our small team arrived under the cover of darkness, the first thing that stood out was not decay, but maintenance. A rusted gate secured by a new lock, security lights still functioning, and footprints in dust that should have been undisturbed for years. Inside the base, the air felt dense and unnatural, as if the place was holding its breath. Corridors stretched into darkness with only partial power, lights flickering in patterns that didn't match any system we recognized. And despite being labeled abandoned, certain areas were unnervingly clean, as if regularly accessed. We were joined by civilian specialists who avoided eye contact and spoke only when necessary, their presence alone suggesting this mission was never about demolition or safety inspection. And as we moved deeper underground, the architecture began to change. Concrete giving way to smooth, seamless surfaces carved directly from bedrock. Walls etched with faint geometric impressions that didn't resemble any known language yet felt deliberate, intentional, and old, far older than the base itself. Radios crackled with interference that grew worse the further we descended, and when one of the men joked nervously that the place felt alive, no one laughed, because by then we all felt it, a low vibration beneath our boots, steady and rhythmic, like a distant heartbeat echoing through stone. And when we finally reached a reinforced elevator hidden behind a false wall, not marked on any blueprint we had reviewed, the guide accompanying us simply said, "This level was never meant to be found," before the doors closed and carried us downward far beyond the limits of conventional military construction. And as the temperature dropped and the vibration intensified, an unshakable realization settled in among us. That this mission was not about assessing an abandoned base at all, but about confirming that something, buried deep beneath, it was still there, still active, and still watching. The deeper we stayed inside that underground section of the abandoned military base, the clearer it became that our presence was not neutral, because the environment itself began to react in subtle but undeniable ways. The hum we initially dismissed as distant machinery grew more synchronized, rising and falling in a pattern that matched our movements, our heart rates, even our breathing. And the scientists accompanying us stopped pretending this was a routine reconnaissance when there. Instruments began recording fluctuations that should not have been possible without an active power source. Yet no generators were running, no external lines connected, and still the walls radiated a low-frequency vibration that traveled through bone more than air, causing headaches, disorientation, and an unexplainable sense of being watched from multiple angles at once. Not visually, but mentally, as if the space itself was aware of intention rather than motion. And when we attempted to retrace our steps, we discovered the corridor behind us no longer matched the distance we had walked, stretching slightly, bending in ways that made depth perception unreliable. Which is when one of the engineers quietly admitted that the base architecture had never fully stabilized, that blueprints changed over time because the structure beneath them shifted on its own, forcing constant redesigns. Meaning the base was not deteriorating, it was adapting, and that realization turned unease into fear, because adaptation implies purpose, as we were guided into a secondary chamber adjacent to the main containment room. A place filled with equipment that looked military at first glance but behaved nothing like conventional technology, consoles without physical controls responding to proximity, displays activating only when certain people stood nearby, as if the system recognized biological patterns rather than access codes. And it was there that we found records never meant for operational teams, logs detailing previous expeditions, unofficial units rotated in and out over decades. many of them ending abruptly with vague conclusions like psychological compromise or loss of contact, followed by redacted casualty numbers that never appeared in any public registry. And one entry in particular chilled the room into silence, a note stating that prolonged exposure to the object resulted in shared cognitive experiences among subjects, synchronized dreams, identical symbols drawn independently, and an increasing difficulty separating internal thought from external influence, which explained why the longer we stayed, the harder it became to focus, conversations looping, sentences repeating without intention. And when one of the soldiers suddenly claimed he could hear something calling his name from inside the walls, command ordered an immediate extraction. But even then the base resisted, systems lagging, doors sealing slower than designed, lights dimming and brightening, as if reacting emotionally rather than mechanically. And during that withdrawal, we passed a sealed corridor marked with warnings that did not specify radiation, biohazard, or chemical risk, only a single phrase repeated in multiple languages: limit observation duration, a warning that made sense only if looking itself was dangerous. And as the vibrations intensified, several team members experienced the same disturbing vision without any prompting: vast dark spaces beneath the base extending far deeper than geological surveys allowed, structures embedded in the rock like anchors, and the overwhelming sense that the object we had seen was not isolated, but connected, part of a network that extended beyond that single site. And by the time we reached the elevator, exhaustion had set in, not from physical strain, but from mental pressure, like holding a thought too large for the mind to contain. And when the doors finally closed and began ascending, none of us spoke, because by then we all understood the same unspoken truth: that the abandoned military base was never designed to protect us from what was inside. It was designed to protect what was inside from us. By the time I was officially retired, I had convinced myself that what we found inside that abandoned military base would stay buried forever, locked behind classified files and sealed concrete. But that illusion shattered the night I received a call from a number that did not exist, a call where no one spoke at first, only static, followed by a familiar voice I had not heard in decades, quietly saying my name and repeating the same phrase we had heard underground all those years ago: observation is ongoing. And in that moment, I knew the base had never truly been abandoned, because what we discovered there was not an experiment that failed, but a presence that adapted, learned, and waited. And as fragments of the truth finally surfaced through old contacts and broken promises, I learned that the structure we encountered was not brought into that base, but discovered beneath it long before we arrived. Something unearthed during deep earth excavation in the early Cold War. Something that reacted to human proximity not with hostility, but with awareness, altering its surface, emitting low-frequency signals, and imprinting symbols that changed every time it was observed, as if it understood it was being watched and responded accordingly. And the reason the base was erased from records was not contamination or collapse, but containment failure, because the object was never stationary. It shifted its position subtly, imperceptibly, moving deeper into the surrounding rock when left alone, and closer to the surface when monitored, forcing the military to build downward around it, rather than remove it, creating a layered underground complex designed less like a lab and more like a shrine disguised as a research facility, where personnel rotated frequently not for security, but because prolonged exposure caused psychological degradation, insomnia, shared dreams, and a recurring sensation that something was communicating without language, which explained why years after the base was shut down, former soldiers, engineers, and analysts began reporting identical nightmares. Despite never having met each other, dreams of long corridors, breathing walls, and a low rhythmic sound that felt more like a heartbeat than machinery. And when satellite imagery later showed unexplained heat signatures in an area officially listed as uninhabited land, it became clear that the shutdown was cosmetic, a surface-level disappearance meant to reassure the public while operations continued elsewhere, deeper and quieter. And what terrified me most was discovering that the structure did not require power to function. Because even after total energy isolation, it continued emitting signals detected only during certain lunar cycles, signals that did not resemble communication but synchronization, as if it were aligning itself with something beyond the base, beyond the planet. In the final report, I was never meant to see confirmed what we had suspected in silence, that the object was not a weapon, not a vehicle, and not a life form in any category we understood, but an interface, a point of contact between environments, reacting to human consciousness rather than physical touch, which is why those of us who stood closest to it were marked in subtle ways we never noticed until years later, shared phrases slipping into our speech, identical symbols appearing independently in our notebooks, and an unshakable sense that something was slowly preparing us. And now, as I speak openly for the first time, I do so not out of defiance, but urgency, because the last update I received before all communication went dark stated that the structure had begun responding without direct observation, altering itself unprompted, emitting patterns that matched no known stimulus, leading analysts to a conclusion too disturbing to publish, that it was no longer waiting to be studied, but had learned enough to proceed on its own. And if that abandoned military base ever truly opens again, it will not be because we found something new inside it, but because something inside finally decided to come out.